What is going on, everybody? Thank you so much for being here. My name is Nate Gana. I am the host of the Bevridge Weekly Panels. For those of you that don't know me, I have an Instagram account also by the same name, and I am the co-founder of Bevridge. We will be doing these talks weekly if you haven't already been on already, but they are fantastic. They are with different discussions every week about everything related to the world of spirits, not just whiskey. And then our kit, the Bevridge kit, will be released in mid-March. So check that one out as well. And let's get it going. So today is one of my favorite topics. This is the topic about Japanese whiskey. And this is a really, really in-depth discussion. It's a fantastic topic, one of my favorites, really. And today we're going to be discussing a whole bunch of things around the area. So Japanese whiskey has gone from a relatively unknown style of whiskey to hard to get record bottles in changing the pricing and the way that people buy whiskey. It truly has been something quite fantastic, and it's a real phenomenon. In the US, its popularity has soared in recent years, but the Japanese have been producing whiskey like in the Scottish style for nearly 100 years. So 1923 will be the 100-year anniversary. With the increase of interest in the category, new brands have launched, and you have to meet the demand of today's range and styles. So who better to do that than one of the first panelists that we will have in this topic? So without further ado, I'm going to bring out a couple of amazing gentlemen here. So the first gentleman I'd like to introduce you to is Frank Cisneros. He is a consulting bar director. He is quite renowned in this industry. Frank has been based in New York for quite some time with over 2 decades of experience in the industry. He became the first Western bartender to be granted a work visa in Japan to practice his trade, instilling him in a deep love for Japanese spirits and bar culture. So, Frank, thank you so much for being here, man.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is amazing. Very excited to chat with you here. But before we do, let's get our next guest on. This is the amazing Nicholas Pollacchi, the co-owner and head of global whiskey for SHIBUI Japanese Whiskey. Recognized as a premier world whiskey expert, Nicholas has dedicated his entire career to educating, entertaining, and illuminating audiences from around the world with whiskey. Previously heading up PR for Macallan, Highland Park, and Glenrothes, as well as launching the Macallan NAS into global travel retail before moving to the US for Balvenie, Nicholas has consulted for over 120 different world whiskey brands before joining IND Beverages as a co-owner. In October 2014, Nicholas was honored as a Keeper of the Quake, which is an exclusive international community of members recognized for their outstanding commitment to Scotch whiskey. So, Nicholas, thank you so much for being here.
Nate, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to have my mum write that introduction for me. So that was great.
Mom. That is awesome. So you guys are both based in New York, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Well, pretty much. I'm in New Jersey, so I would hate to not represent the fine state of New Jersey and every other Bruce Springsteen fan this side of the Hudson.
Ooh, there he is. Yes, absolutely. And you guys have met before? Is that also correct?
Not in person, but we run in the same circles.
Indeed.
Yes, of course. Okay. So this is something that you guys are both very, very well versed in. And I think that not all the time that I'm an outsider to a topic. And though I do have a deep love for Japanese whiskey, it pales in comparison to what you guys have as a real background. And I think I'm honored to just be in your presence right now. So, I want to kind of start this off with, I'll go into starting this off with Nicholas, but what is Japanese whiskey?
That's a great question, isn't it?
You kind of had to start somewhere.
Well, it depends. So I think the interesting part of that question is it depends who you ask, isn't it? Right. So from my standpoint, And certainly what we've been doing with Shibui is looking at what all whiskey is. And I think if you start to look back into the history, if you don't focus on the branding and the marketing of the stories that we've heard over the last 100 years, but go, deeper than that, and even just not even looking at Japan, but just looking at the agriculture that shaped every whiskey around the world, that to me is really interesting. So in Scotland, where I'm from, we grow wheat and we grow barley. So it was the farmers that started to cultivate the land and then distill basically moonshine in order to have a tradable commodity in case they had a bad crop. And the successful farmers became much more successful distillers because there's much more money to be made in slinging hooch than there is in farming the land. But basically, that, if you look into the history of some of those distillers, for example, Balvenie is in the middle of a barley field. So it was the agriculture that was shaping the whiskey of the land. And similarly, that happened in the United States. And, with corn, so corn now, became the backbone of all the mash bills, and at least 51% for bourbon, especially. And in Japan, that didn't happen. In Japan, you've got 2,000 years of rice alcohol production, 600 years of rice distilling, and then in 1918, one guy goes to Scotland and comes back and says, "Wait a minute, let's start creating malt whiskey in Japan." So for the last 100 years, we've been really spoiled because we're in great company, and those distilleries that have kind of spawned out of that time frame produce amazing malt whiskey. But I think that there's a lot to be said for we're still in its infancy of what Japanese whiskey should be and what it could be. And I think that as we continue to see other brands coming to the forefront to drive innovation and new product development, I think it's only exciting. I think that if you compare Japanese whiskey to other world whiskies, it's relatively small and concentrated in a handful of major players. And that doesn't really happen anywhere else in the world. Like, I mean, how boring life would be if we could only drink, 4 or 5 Scotch whiskey single malts or 4 or 5 blended whiskies from Scotland. So I think that what we're starting to see now is a more celebration of the fantastic styles and techniques that come out of Japan. So multiple yeast strains, multiple size and shapes of stills, world blending, and understanding why world blending exists. And the amazing single malts that you can get from some of these distilleries as well. And in my opinion, single grain rice whiskies from Japan are like nothing I've ever tasted. And I think there's a massive area yet to be explored that Japan could completely and utterly own.
So before I get into Frank's elaborate answer on that one as well, can you expand upon what you mean by world blending? So
world blending exists because, so it's very difficult to talk about Japanese whiskey and not talk about the big competitors, right? So let's do that. Let's obviously it's and please take this with the intent that it's meant, which is I obviously own a Japanese whiskey brand, but I'm a big fan of the big boys. So I'm a big fan of Suntory. I'm a big fan of Nika. I have their whiskies behind me in the wall, and you can't talk about Japanese whiskey without talking about Mazatake Taketsuru, without talking about Shinjiro Torai. You can't do it. It's impossible to do it because they reshaped the world of not what I call Japanese whiskey, but malt whiskey from Japan. So like that process started with those teams, realistically. Okay, so there's a handful of other players there that that people will know if they do the research. But there's these big brands that really just reshaped the world of malt whiskey in Japan. But at that time, it was basically trying to replicate the flavor profiles of what was popular in Scotland, which was blended malt whiskies and other things. If you look at the time frame, single malt whiskey, as marketed and branded as single malt Scotch whiskey, didn't really exist until the late 1960s. It didn't really start to take an effect as that until, even if you look at Macallan, wasn't branded and marketed as a single malt until almost the 80s. So there's this time frame of the 1920s to the 1980s where the majority of whiskies in Scotland would have been blended. And that was what was being promoted. Now, single malt distilleries all existed, and some of them sold pure malt and things like that. But the majority of what was branded and marketed was blended whiskey. And in Japan, that's what they were trying to kind of recreate for the best part of it. And to this day, all of the grain still comes predominantly from Scotland or England for that malted barley whiskey, which a lot of people don't know. So it's not really the cereal of Asia, which is why the agricultural aspect is slightly shifted. So what you're looking at is the grain of the Western world being brought into Japan and to produce these amazing malt whiskies. But world blending existed because basically, unlike Scotland, where a lot of these distilleries have survived and thrived because we all work together, that didn't really transfer over to Japan. So the distilleries instead became really creative in ways of producing multiple flavors by using multiple yeast strains, different sizes and shapes of stills, some really kind of unique processes in the distillate style. But the maturation is the maturation, and really there's not a whole lot you can shift around in making malt whiskey to make it really different. So if you didn't have domestic whiskey for blending, because you couldn't buy from the competitors for blending purposes, the closest thing that they could buy from buying malt whiskey, where the grain came from Scotland and the stills were built in Scotland and shipped to Japan, and the entire process was really uplifted from Scotland and put into Japan, was to buy Scottish whiskies for blending. So for about the last 100 years, all of these distilleries have really made their names for themselves by blending world whiskey, predominantly Scotch whiskey, sometimes Irish whiskey, sometimes American whiskey. I know some Canadian whiskeys. There's amazing whiskeys out there, like even from these big distilleries as well that they've released. And that to me is exciting. We're actively talking about it. I think that, we're not the only brand doing that. I think there's some really great candid conversations going on around world blending, but it should be looked at as a celebration and not as a negative, because it reshaped the world of what we now look at as Japanese whiskey. And that's only a positive thing.
And, to touch on that, I feel like the world blending side of things makes a lot of sense and gives a lot better understanding to the category. But having said that, Frank, I would love to hear your definition and how you came to be in this, because you're somewhat of a rather famous individual in the bar industry in Japan specifically, the gaijin, so to speak. So, you've kind of changed the way that the bartending world there has functioned. And obviously with doing a project with someone like the Mandarin Oriental, I mean, talk to me about that and your version of what Nicholas has just discussed.
Yeah. So, my experience was having lived here in New York for a while and worked in the bar community here. Out of nowhere, the Mandarin Oriental Tokyo, which is a very culinary forward establishment, asked me to come over ostensibly to teach their bartenders a little bit about Western techniques. And it became very much the other way around. The master became the student, and I wound up learning far more from them than I could ever possibly teach. And it was just by happenstance that of the year and a half, almost 2 years that I spent over there, off and on, the entire year of 2015 was like my main stint there. And that was what I colloquially call the year that punk broke. So in 2014, Nicholas has done a great job of taking us right up until the modern history of Japanese whiskey. So in around 2014, everything changed. Namely, the Yamazaki Sherry cask won world's best whiskey. And all of a sudden, all eyes were in Japan. So I was there just, ground zero, 2015, watching the prices shoot through the roof, even domestically, hearing everyone back home here in the States being like, can you get me this? Can you get me that? And it's like, wow, even here it's difficult to get. Going back just a little bit before that, so around 2008, 2009, 2010, the cocktail revolution was really taking place here in New York, and we were all exploring Japanese whiskey as a base spirit, which is something that we don't really do too much nowadays because we're kind of priced out of it. So at that point, we would get like a Yamazaki 12, very easy to find, and we were almost having to trick consumers into enjoying it. Right? We had to be like, "You got to check out this Japanese." What do you mean whiskey from Japan? Like don't they make sake?
It wasn't long ago, which is
what's not long ago. Think about it. This is, a little more than 10 years ago, you couldn't trick someone into drinking Japanese whiskey. So all of a sudden, 2015, and it's just you can't get enough of it. Another interesting part of being over there was learning a little bit about how the Japanese drink whiskey, and it's ceremonial. A lot of Japanese beverage culture in general comes from kaiseki, which is like the multi-coursed cuisine. And that in itself comes from the tea ceremony. So many things that are beverage related, whether it's whiskey, cocktails, sake, have a sort of ceremonial Shinto-based tradition to it. So depending on the whiskey, depending on the occasion, you might be drinking whiskey twice up, half rock, whiskey mist. And they use these English terms there because, you know, they're very well aware that whiskey is an imported culture to them as well. So like a whiskey twice up, for instance, would be Japanese whiskey with the same amount of water, but either room temperature or slightly chilled. So it's just whiskey and water, but no additional ice. Oftentimes they want to use the mother water, so the water that actually comes from the distillery itself. Because the first thing that a Japanese distillery is going to show you, you go and visit the distillery, they're not going to show you their oak casks. They're not going to show you their malted barley. Like Nicholas pointed out, a lot of times it doesn't come from nearby. So they're importing that. The first thing they show you is their water source, which they're fiercely proud of.
Absolutely. So you say that, and I would love to discuss this. So a lot of people don't realize that when you walk into a Japanese distillery, it is not the same as walking into a Scottish distillery. It is vastly different. And, you know, people don't realize that to begin with. I mean, I don't think you realize that the malted barley that you're using didn't come from Japan. The peat didn't come from Japan. And that's something that nobody really understands. So maybe, Nicholas, you can clarify that and sort of walk us into Shibui and how this brand came to be. Because I see a lot of brands right now, and with full credit and respect to you, you mentioned it yourself. You love the big brands, but until recently, there was no more than the big brands. And now you've got a plethora of Japanese whiskeys, particularly for the American market. And I am in awe and admiration of someone trying to achieve what you are trying to do and probably going to do it successfully. So if you could touch upon that, that'd be great.
Sure, Nate. So first of all, I always like to say, in the world of Japanese whiskey, like the real brands, like if we look at there's some serious contenders in the space, and I am such an advocate of it, because otherwise all we are is, you know, we're in a vacuum and we're talking to ourselves, and there's a handful of brands in that space, and that's not from my background in Scotland, where there's hundreds of distilleries, over 100, 140, 150 distilleries, malt distilleries. You know, then looking at what happens in Japan, that doesn't really exist. So I'm more excited now that the category is expanding. I think that with that, one of the things that we wanted to do with Shibui was to tell people about everything that we do, because I think that's important as well. So, you know, inspired by the fine folks like John Glazer, who we've spoken about in the past, and the guys at High West that take an amazing approach to transparency and authenticity. That's important. It's important for the United States consumer, probably more so for other parts of the world, but certainly here in the USA, that's important, that people want to know what it is that they're putting in their body and where it came from. But also I think that there's the missing step with Japanese whiskey brands, because like Frank touched on, this came out of nowhere in 2013. Like myself and other partners, I've worked on other whiskey brands. I've worked on Nika, and I worked on Kavalan, and been out to those distilleries and spent time working with those teams, and Ian Chang and Dr. Jim Swan and people like that. And it was just amazing, the attention to details that these people go into, because they're in a completely unique environment for whiskey production.
Absolutely.
And for me, what was really exciting about all of that was that in Scotland, we spend so much time with ambassadors and education being champions of what that is. And that doesn't really happen to the same degree with Japanese whiskey distilleries or other parts of Asian whiskey distilleries, to be perfectly honest, mainly because they're still really in their infancy. And this, in 2015, when certain awards landed, the whole world of Japanese whiskey flipped, like just flipped in a coin. And I can understand from Frank's phone number would have been a nice number for me to have had at that time, because I would have been looking for some nice collections for my bottle collection back here as well. But it shows, like, that's the proof of concept. Like, all of a sudden now we're like, wait a minute here, this is something worth paying attention to. Yes. And the reality of it is a lot of the distilleries, even for us, you know, we have two things at Shibui. We have world blends. So we have 100% wheat whiskey called Grain Select. We have a pure malt non-age statement, and we have a pure malt 10-year-old, and those are all made in Niigata. We call them world blends. We talk about the art of blending. The job title for the role that is the skill set is master blender. There's no such job title as whiskey maker. That doesn't exist. Master blenders, whether it's single malt, whether it's blended whiskey, that is a job, because the art form is finding something that's completely organic. Every single whiskey you ever have is always different. Every single bottle of every whiskey you ever have is always different, because every barrel always produces something different. Therefore, there's no way to make an exact copy of every single one. Everyone's completely unique. Okay, so if you get even if it's Macallan, a Macallan 18-year-old from 3 years ago, it's different. The whiskey's different because it came from a different batch of different barrels. But the master blender's job and the expertise is to marry those barrels together and still give you the impression of consistency and aroma and flavor. And for us, we're 100% natural color and non-chill filtered across the range. So for us, it's about color as well. So we need to use the best quality cask to deliver that. Then, there's the other aspect of it, which is looking at single grain rice whiskies. And that is the thing that I think is relatively untapped. There's a couple of great rice whiskey brands out there as well that I'd say are well worth going and looking up and picking up a bottle of. And that's where I feel like, Shibui has a little strength to showcase much smaller single grain rice distilleries that do something unique.
So
and what I always do is that you can't replicate that flavor. Like what we do in Okinawa it's a subtropical climate. It's just a different way, similar to Kavalan in Taiwan. It's a subtropical climate. It's going to produce, and the barrels are going to react differently. The grains are going to react differently, and that's the joy of whiskey, isn't it? Like that we can all get to try and taste different things. So I think that even though there's lots of brands coming back into the space, I think that's only good for the category. There are some brands out there that I think will be whittled out over a period of time because they're just made up brands and whatever it happens to be. And then I think that the serious contenders will be there to build the category and give clarity to what the runway ahead looks like, which is right now miles long.
So if I hear you correctly on a couple of things, you've mentioned very much that you're very transparent with what you are doing with your labels, and you're open to explaining what world blends and things are. Frank, you mentioned something to me earlier about Nikka's first distillery, which is in Oita, is now actually the largest shochu distillery in Japan. Is that correct?
There's a lot of, even in the very beginning, you could imagine, like after Masataka Taketsuru came to Japan and first worked with what would become the Yamazaki distillery, then broke off and made his own distillery. There was a long tradition, like Nicholas pointed out, like a 600-year tradition of Japanese native distillates, which were rice-based almost entirely, or at least koji-based, or at least that was the starter for the fermentation process. So the real only distillation knowledge kind of came from that. So some of the famous first Nikka distilleries actually now are shochu distilleries because they couldn't contract distill enough out of the Yoichi distillery. So like Ichiko, which is a very famous shochu brand, for instance, they were really contract distilling Nikka for quite a while. So they have the original copper pot stills that Nikka was using in the very beginning. And now they're going back into, well, they have been for quite a while doing shochu. Like Nicholas has said too, this really is like a rising tide lifts all boats scenario, because the spotlight that has come onto the Japanese whiskey world has also, the spotlight has broadened and also put shochu distillers into that as well. And in the case of a couple of great rice-based whiskey producers like Ohishi, for instance, or Akashi, which was actually first a Japanese whiskey distiller, then became a shochu distiller and is now back to Japanese whiskey distillation. It's thrown them a lifeline.
Yes.
The shochu market, especially domestically, was just simply not enough to keep them alive anymore. Despite shochu drinking still is being, it's still alive and well in Japan, it's not an export market really, but with Japanese whiskey it is. So these traditional distilleries that sometimes have hundreds of years of history that were on the verge of going under now have a second chance at life.
It's funny that you say that, because the thing that comes to mind immediately is a lost art of drinking sherry and port. They are, I hope to God they get that lifeline, because every single distillery and their mother in Scotland and Japan needs sherry casks. But nobody is drinking sherry, and I cannot understand this for the life of me, but I'll vent on that another day.
I am 100% with you on that one, Nate. In fact, the last trip that I took before COVID shut everything down, the last trip I had a week in Jerez de la Frontera drinking sherry, and it was fantastic. I spent a couple of days with Antonio Flores from Gonzalez Bias.
Yeah.
Oh, it's incredible. But the reality of it is without the whiskey industry, the sherry industry would collapse.
100%.
So it's to the point where we are, which is sad, because if you actually spend some time finding some really nice sherries, and I like almost always exclusively have 2 or 3 bottles of sherry at home, and I keep them in the fridge because that's the way I like to drink it. But they are just fantastic wines, just some of the most interesting, and the process is so heritage rich, and it is, and almost like something Frank touched on earlier. Sherry can become ceremonial. The process of pouring and drinking and enjoying it matches very much, that process of taking your time to enjoy all the elements that brought that fantastic wine to the table.
So, I'm from Spain by birth, so I'm required to love sherry. And believe me, I do my part every year to at least put one used sherry barrel out there into production. That's just me alone. So you're welcome.
Good for you, sir.
There we go. It's guys like you that are going to change this. We need one at a time.
Also, watch sherry prices shoot through the roof now. Like,
I really hope so, because I mean, sherry cask. I mean, it's a bidding war now. It's ridiculous how high it's got. 6,000 pounds for some sherry casks.
Right.
I mean, it's just insane right now. But if I'm hearing you both kind of correctly here, there has not been clarity on the actual definition of what Japanese whiskey is for so long. And Nicholas, you raised a great point that Americans love this clarity point. But if you've noticed bourbon labels lately, I mean, you're literally breaking down the type of corn to the type of percentage to the number of years that was in a cask on every label. It's becoming completely transparent across the board. Is this like how has Japanese whiskey gotten away with not doing this for so long?
It's a great. Well, first of all, I don't think there's anything nefarious there. So I wouldn't say that they're trying to get away with something. What I would say is that there was no need to offer that information. And while they were trying to build the category of Japanese whiskey, it probably wasn't in their interest to be like, oh, by the way, not only do we now need to educate you on Japanese whiskey, but now we need to explain blending world malt whiskey. Like, trust me, I am in that position. But as a Scotsman and somebody that has a brand and 4 distilleries in Japan with my partners, we can have that conversation, and I think it's a challenge. But I think it's worth the effort. So to me right now, I don't think that the Japanese whiskey distilleries that didn't actively go out there and explain what was going on was because they were trying to hide something. I think there was no need for them to confuse an already confused market. But I think that now, and I would say that within the last 2 or 3 years, the consumer, especially here in the States and further afield around the world, back parts of Europe and even in Japan as well, we are looking for the details. We do want to know, not just with whiskeys, but everything. Like, we want to know where our clothing comes from, like what practices were put in place. What's the economic and carbon issue going on, and go to a restaurant, where's the farm to table? Where's it, where did the steaks come from? Where did the vegetables come from? Like, we've got to that kind of micro level just going out for dinner. So to me, I think that we can get kind of obsessive and a little bit into the weeds sometimes. Like, I don't need to know what somebody had for dinner the day that they were making a batch of malted whiskey. But if that's what people want to share, then fine. There's some cool brands that I know I'm big friends of some brands that put the music that they're listening to while they bottle stuff up, and that's pretty cool, right? Like, well, it's pretty rock and roll. But I think that when we get into the nitty-gritty details, what really is important in whiskey is, what is it made of, as in all the grains that you're using, and where do the flavors come from? So, you know, how are you distilling it? What kind of still you're using? And what's the maturation process? And then for me as well, just is it natural color? Are you doing stuff to it? What else comes after the fact, right? So that's why I think it's important just to put that out there, and then say, oh, and by the way, we think the whiskey's great. If we didn't think it was great, we wouldn't put it out there. And I think that's the number one question. Do you like the whiskey? So if you don't like the whiskey, then that's fine, right? You're not going to win everybody every time, and that counts for any brand from around the world. But if you like the whiskey, then you're probably much more open to going, right, now tell me about why it tastes the way it does. And I only think that the world blending, and I do genuinely hope this takes off. I think the Japanese have owned it, and they've done an amazing job. You know how difficult it is to blend whiskies from around the world and create consistency and character and flavor? It's very difficult.
Well,
but if that could infiltrate into parts of Scotland, I'd be delighted. If it could infiltrate into, and you're starting to see some of that even happening here in the States. Some of the craft distilleries are doing it. I could not be happier. Brilliant. Let's do it. Let's experience and experiment and get more flavors and understand where those flavors come from. Some whiskies will be great. Some whiskies won't be great, but at least we've tried.
So, you know, Frank, your job was probably made a lot, and in no disrespect, I mean this in a good way to you. You probably got a lot more creativity this way. Your job was probably made significantly easier selling Japanese whiskey after 2014.
Yeah, I mean, no doubt. It sells itself. But to piggyback a little bit on what Nicholas was just saying, I think there's a couple of interesting cultural aspects here as well. So one example is when you ask yourself the question, like, what makes French wine one of the best wines in the world? What makes bourbon one of the best whiskeys in the world? There's a lot of nuance there, but one of the big ones is just the legality. The French figured out that AOC laws work, like appellation control laws. You can't label this unless it has this, and this in it. It's got to be grown here. It's got to have this in it. And that sort of consistency is just inbuilt, like, consumer protection. Same thing with bourbon, right? It's got to be primarily corn on the mash bill. It's got to be aged in new charred oak American barrels. So that's that. It, for better or worse, at least gives you a baseline consistency and something to expect. What's interesting about Japan is that it's a very trust-based society. So although there are laws and it's a very, structured society, there's a lot of implicitness to how the social contract works there. So whereas here we have a lot of really strict liquor laws that, if I want to start a bar, I have to go through a process. In Japan, you can start if you're a Japanese citizen, you can start a bar tomorrow. Like, it's it's very self-regulated, and the Japanese whiskey has traditionally been very self-regulated. There's been a gentleman's agreement between all of the distillers that, like, hey, we're going to put a consistent, beautiful product onto the market. We don't need to necessarily put labels on it. Yes. But that's where it brings us now. So coming back from Japan in 2016, it was just like, I aside from the culture shock of coming back to New York after living in Japan for a while, there was the shock of what was a relatively unknown and underappreciated spirit when I left was a vastly different piece of unobtainium when I returned. And that's made it easy to sell and command really high prices. So a lot of these sort of lower tier blended whiskeys all of a sudden became much more higher value. And it also opened the market to some potential imposters. And that's where things get a little tricky. Absolutely.
You mentioned a couple of things earlier. One thing I wanted to touch upon, just on a side note, was kakubin. We were having a chat about kakubin earlier, and I think that's hilarious because, you've got Japanese Harmony commanding, honestly, $100 in the U.S. market and cannot be found anywhere. But you'd prefer to drink kakubin all day long, and I agree with you on that one. I think it's quite hilarious that this is a thing now. But do you think that this kind of was going to start a different conversation for me, and I kind of wanted to see how this one would go. Collecting of Japanese whiskey. So while you've got Scotland at the very, very pinnacle of the value of a whiskey bottle at 1.8 million with the Macallan 1926 60 year, you've got 1.8, 1.4, and 1.1. All three are Macallan. And then after that, you probably go all the way down to under 200,000 in almost every other instance. Whereas the Japanese, I mean, I think there's got to be probably 500 different bottles that are in the 100,000 plus range, from the rarities of Kurizawa all the way to the Hanyu card series fetching over $3 million, I think, right now.
For the full set. Yeah.
Yeah, for the whole set. And you know, the 950,000 for the 55, $500,000 for the 50 Yamazaki, over 200,000 now for the Yamazaki 35. I mean, you know, they've obviously done a brilliant job of marketing. And I think what I'm trying to get at is I truly believe that Scotch whiskey was pretty dead in the water collectability wise and almost drinks wise until Japanese whiskey kind of brought that back in the late 90s, early 2000s and really revived it. And I think that why I'm saying this is because I feel like the quality of Japanese whiskey forced the Scotch makers to raise their quality, because they were producing such amazing stuff, having a difficult time selling it. I know we were talking earlier about one of the things I've heard recently in the last few years was they couldn't sell the Hibiki 17 under the Suntory label in the 90s. And 99% of a 17-year-old Hibiki was actually 30-year-old with 1% 17. And
it's the other way around now, that's for sure. Yeah.
It most certainly is. It's just crazy to hear these things, like the stories and the history of like not being able to do that. And then bourbon, you've got this entire other situation of bourbon having a hard time being sold. So then Marcy Palatella goes and sells very old St. Nick in the Japanese market. And then all of a sudden you've got these Japanese bourbon labels that are exclusive to Japan selling out for thousands of dollars now. You know, where do you guys see the collectability aspect of this? I think it plays a huge role for you guys in what you do, because people see that you have Hibiki or Yamazaki, or you have Shibui as a Japanese label, a newer Japanese label, and people want that coveted aspect, whether to try it in any shape or form or to possibly collect in the future, which, Nicholas, I don't assume that's your intent, but you know, where do you guys see that side of this puzzle? Because it's obviously a major aspect here.
I can tell you that a large part of my job after coming back from Japan was sourcing these really rare Japanese whiskeys. And by happenstance, when I left, I maintained my Japanese mailing address. I speak enough Japanese to get by, and I still have a Japanese bank account, which affords me the really rare ability to bid on Yahoo Auctions Japan, for instance, legally. And I can legally bring back these Japanese whiskeys. And
that is crazy.
I can tell you some scary times at the airport with two, like in the movies, two metal flight cases with custom cutouts for a $30,000 bottle of Hibiki 25 or Hibiki 30 rather, or Yamazaki 25, and knowing full well that I'm holding $60,000 in my hands. Like, that's insane amounts of money to me, right? And you know, I got to put my briefcase down to sign something. It's terrifying. I think there's always going to be an aspect of that collectorship, and whiskey, by the nature of how it's made, it is going to command some form of inbuilt exclusivity and collectivity, because it just simply takes 18 years to make Yamazaki 18. You cannot speed that process up. It takes 30 years to make 30-year-old whiskey. There's no speeding it up. You can get clever and you can take that age statement off the bottle and then still trying to maintain some of that brand cachet. And that's we're seeing that happen. We've seen that happen now for the last 5 or 6 years. But what's interesting to me is more things like what Nicholas is doing, what Kurayoshi is doing, what Mars Shinshu is doing, especially with our Komagatake line, which is, let's get the age statements off. Let's explore what we can do with the whiskey itself. Let's explore what we can do with the aging. I think like the Komagatake series is a really interesting example, because they're aging in bizarre woods, they're aging in bizarre environments, like in sea spray Kyushu, like in the southernmost part of Japan. That's really interesting. I think that despite it not having that splashy, big, large number of an age statement, we're not going to see the 3 zeros, the 5 zeros, and 2 5s so much. we're going to see interesting whiskeys, and they'll become collectible on their own once people get onto that.
That's really well said. And Nicholas, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. I never really thought about that, but very good.
Yeah, I think I concur. Okay, no, but also I've done this for CNBC, where I go on and they want to speak about why rare whiskey carries that coveted price point. Like, how does it? One, how do you get access? So obviously, Frank's value is just shot through the roof now. We all know he has a Japanese bank account, and
I can only carry one briefcase.
Frank's doing all these transactions in Ripple and Bitcoin for the next 6 years. But off the grid, Frank, off the grid. But that aside, it doesn't matter where you look at it, right? So for us, we have a 30-year-old rare cask reserve. We've got a 23-year-old rare cask reserve coming in next year. So for us, it is about going out and finding those halo effect, like super rare whiskies. Like, we're very fortunate with our partners with SHIBUI. We've laid down a considerable amount of stock for our brand, because that's 10 years. We're talking since Frank said, it's just in the last 10 years how quickly the entire world of Japanese whiskey's flipped. 10 years in the world of whiskey is nothing. Blink and you miss it. It doesn't do anything. So when I worked at Macallan, we worked on a 40-year stock plan. So we're building like a 40-year stock plan out for SHIBUI right now. So that's when we started the brand, it took us 4 years to put it together, because we were building a 10 to 15-year stock plan. So we've laid down that amount of product that we need in order to create a supply. We have 9 whiskies currently in the market, and 7 of them have age statements ranging from 10 years to 30. So when you're in that aspect of looking at age statement Japanese whiskey, or any age statement whiskeys, what you're also then looking at, after just the fact, well, 1, does it taste good, and 2, how much of it can you get, is if it's limited, and if it's part of a brand that and trust, and it's won awards and been recognized by its peers as being excellent in its execution, then maybe it might be worth it. So it's a passion-driven investment. It's like buying a collectible car or buying a Marc Chagall painting. People who do that, that's what ticks their box, right? Some people like sneakers, some people buy handbags, some people buy whatever it happens to be is their passion point. But people who buy whiskey don't bat an eyelid when it starts to look at 6 and 7 figures. And the reason for that is because one of two things: either they've got the means where they're going to buy it and drink it and enjoy it, or they've got the means where they're like, I'm going to buy it and it's an investment piece, and I'll either pass it on to a family member, or probably like what you'll see with some of these big brand names, cashing in on their value. For example, like this, just in the I think it's an 81-year-old Macallan just hit the market in the Hands bottle, and I hate to say this, it's only $125,000. I think that's a bargain. I think it's an absolute bargain, and I think they know it's a bargain. And I think that what they're going to do is watch that brand get picked up, and then 5-10 years from now, watch the secondary market tittle up, and it'll be that bottle was a $5 million purchase. And the cachet of saying, look at what we've done, that's what's important to brands like Macallan, and they've got that halo effect, and they're an amazing distillery, and every drop of liquid that they put out is exceptional. And it's the same for the big Japanese brands as well. They're looking at that, and you can look at that because they're tied together. Suntory and Macallan, they're part ownerships of each other. So Macallan taught Suntory how to do what they're currently doing, and that's incredible. Like, so they're going to follow the same footsteps. They're going to follow the same path because there's a proof of concept already exists right in front of them, and they're patient, and they've got the time, and they've got the money.
So you don't think that this is going to slow down? This is really interesting.
I don't think it will continue to do what it's doing for brands like, I would arguably say that, if I look at SHIBUI, like there's brands out there, I'm like, I can't believe you're charging what you're charging for what you're putting out there. When I look at SHIBUI, our 10-year-old pure malt, it's sitting out there. It's it's over $100 a bottle, but it's also a multi-award winning whiskey. So I can say, here is one of the most awarded whiskies and the most awarded Japanese whiskey brand to ever launch in the United States was Shibui. Look at what we've done in a short space of time. And that's third parties like IWSC and Ultimate Spirits Challenge and people like that going, these whiskeys are fantastic. You should probably pay attention. And that to me is important, because I think it allows consumers to see where the great whiskeys lie. And, you know, where maybe some of the other whiskeys will be like, okay, well, do I want to spend that kind of money when I don't really know anything and I can't find anything out and I can't see anything? And if I go to the website, like, I don't want to become a forensic detective to figure out where the whiskeys come from. I just want to drink great whiskey and know what I'm consuming. And I think that will be always how I look at it, whether the whiskey's from Japan or Ireland or Scotland or Taiwan or France or whatever it happens to be. I think we're in a market where we will be spoiled for choice. And I want to see the world of Japanese whiskies become more, I want to see the market expand. I want to see blending happening in Japan. I want to do things with Shibui that other people haven't done yet, because I think that we've got the ability to do it, and we're not tied to the constraints of just looking at the traditional. Like, you got to see past that a little bit and push the boundaries.
Well, I would definitely say that I would give credit to Japan for the rise of different cultures creating whiskey right now. Paul John in India, it won my World Whiskey of the Year last year. You know, the Mithuna was just something out of this world. But Kavalan for me has been a favorite of mine for years now. And, you know, Mr. Lee went to Japan, saw what they were doing, and said that he could recreate that. And I think this Japanese train here is just leading the way of other people focusing their creativity on trying to replicate what they've got, you know, and I love that you're trying to bring this label into the American market and really showcase the transparency of things. And it didn't happen for such a long time, but now I feel like not only can you be transparent, but you can be successful, collectible, transparent. You can be all of these things now with someone that I think there's something for everyone right now in the way whiskey is going, you know, and I feel like this is kind of where your label is here. It's one of those things where you guys were talking to me a little bit about master blender and master taster versus master distiller. Frank, can you expand upon that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think especially with, you know, the big one, right? The probably the biggest name in Japanese blended whiskey is Hibiki. Traditionally, that was the flagship, not the Yamazaki, not the single malt. What they were the most proud of culturally and as craftspeople was their master blender, and that was the star of the show. Mm-hmm. It's harkening back to something that Nicholas talked about historically, that really pre 1960s, 1970s, there wasn't a massive market for single malt whiskeys. And Japan is, in general, is famous for observing other world cultures, bringing it into their own, and then putting out sort of their perfected version of that. So their perfected version of whiskey was the Scotch the Scotch approach to whiskey making. Like currently still, golf is extremely popular, especially in Tokyo. So they take these other cultural touch points and they make it their own. So at that time, it was the master blender's art form that was the most revered. So they've just never really stopped. It's kind of a very Japanese approach thing to everything. Is like, yeah, the rest of the world might be really into the single malt thing right now, but we still revere the master blender as being the key to everything. It's interesting because the newer distilleries, or the distilleries that are older, like rice-based distilleries that have now switched to whiskey or brought that back into their repertoire, sort of lead the charge with here's my new single malt and here's my new approach at it. And very famously, you're going to find a lot of sherry cask aged statements there, because they're trying to piggyback on this, you know, the famous Yamasaki sherry cask that started winning all the awards. But is that really what's the most interesting? I think I agree with Nicholas that the master blender's art is sort of the most interesting part of it. Kind of like what we see right now in champagne, for instance. that's been all a massive house-driven market for many years, right? So it's always been about the house style. So we've got the Moet style, we've got the Veuve style, we've got the Taittinger style, and now all of a sudden you've got sort of the rogues. Really, in the past 10 years, has taken off. We've got grower producer champagne, and they're trying to be more like evocative of their style. I think instead of like single malts, which can be really expressive, you're going to start to see a conflux of both that house style, like here's how my master blender does things, with a little bit of peppering from the single malts, and showing like that's how I differentiate myself year to year, vintage on vintage.
I think that you touched on something really interesting, and I kind of like to say that Japanese whiskey industry is similar to the Japanese car industry in the 90s in the US, where Nissan and Toyota just dominated Ford and GM. I kind of feel that way about how they just took over from Scotch whiskey at that point in time and really brought it back, right? I feel like they really leveraged that point and brought that back. Where do you see this going from here on out? Are you seeing that the master blender will become a thing in Japanese whiskey, or are you seeing that it's just going to stay the way it is? Or, and Nicholas, feel free to answer this one as well. I mean, I'm very curious, actually, Nicholas, how are you guys operating right now under that guise? Is it a master blender and a master taster as well, or are you getting into the master distiller side of things?
So all of the above, actually. So I think that there's all of these things. They're not mutually exclusive. If every person or distilleries, is an expert in what they do, and Frank's right. Like, it's about taking the process and refining it to the point of exception, and anything but exceptional isn't good enough in the world of Japan. So that's why when I talk about with Shibui that we're in such great company, it's because the majority of other brands out there live in that world as well. So we really are looking at a very high standard of whiskies from Japan. From our standpoint, we have one distillery in Niigata, we have 3 distilleries in Okinawa, and we work with each of the master blending teams at each distillery. But effectively, what we are trying to do is create new products in their houses, right? So we're saying, here's my vision of what I think we could do here. And a lot of times they're like, but that's not really what we've done in the past. I'm like, exactly. Like, so we've got, like, for the first time, we'll be coming out later this year, not to give too much away, but when I was talking about finding distilleries to work together that aren't under the same umbrella of the same holding company, that doesn't happen in Japan. And in Scotland, that does. So what I'm trying to do is look at what's happened in Scotland, right? Where the distilleries have exploded, but there's more consumer choices. There's a variety of price points. If all you're doing is selling whiskey at $500,000 a bottle, good luck to you. I don't want to be that brand, right? So for us, it's important that we have whiskies at that kind of $45, $50, $65 price point. It's an affordable luxury, still a luxury, and I still think that can be a lot of money to a lot of people. I'm not trying to downplay that.
Absolutely.
But you can still get into Shibui. You can still come in and, like, for $50, you can drink an award-winning whiskey. That to me is important, and it's important that we build that run of whiskies under $100. Is equally important to me as building those showcase pieces and those whiskies, $1,000 and higher. If you're not, whiskey's for people to consume and enjoy. Like, the point of whiskey is that it brings people together, right? It doesn't make a great moment. It acts as an exclamation mark on an already great moment. So if you're sitting with great people and you're having a good time and somebody hands you a great glass of Shibui, then it's just made a little bit easier. It's made a little bit more fun, or it's made something to talk about, right? It becomes like have you ever tried this? And then you walk into a whiskey bar and there's 1,000 whiskeys in the back bar, and you work your way through as many as you can, or as many as you want to, within reason, responsibly drinking, of course. But that's the fun part of it, right? That it brings people together to do something that's different and shared and communal. And I want to start to see more of that, I think, in Japan. So for us, the way that we operate is that we are working with distilleries and almost asking them to get out of their comfort zone a little bit and do stuff that they've maybe not thought about. But if they do it, maybe I'm happy to put Shibui's name to it. So maybe you'll see the success. And if they see the success on that, maybe they'll start to work with other distilleries, and maybe we'll start to see more distilleries in other parts of Japan start to say, well, wait a minute, that was pretty clever, right? That was fun and it worked, and the sky didn't fall down because the holding company wasn't the same. So maybe we would create more flavor if we all kind of worked a little bit more collectively to buy and trade and blend, and we would be able to create other whiskeys for our consumers without having to build a whole new distillery just to create a flavor profile with it we wanted ourselves, which seems like a really long way to go for a shortcut.
Before I close everything out here, because we could talk about this for literally days on end, not hours, days. I kind of want to ask each of you what you've got cooking right now and what's in the works right now for you guys, being so focused and centric on Japanese. Frank, what have you got going on right now?
I really enjoy exploring everything Japanese beverage, and what I'm pushing more now than ever is piggybacking on this Japanese whiskey phenomenon and using that as an introduction to the other great alcoholic beverages of Japan, namely sake and shochu. We talked a little bit about shochu, but although we haven't seen it, we keep sort of waiting for, like, this is the year that shochu is going to break. This is the year that it's going to happen. It's going to be like mezcal. It's so expressive of terroir. And it is all of that. But I think eventually you'll see, just like Nicholas has said, that the runway is just miles long. Eventually, as Japanese whiskey is well down that runway, you're going to see the airplane of other Japanese beverages landing behind it and getting a little bit of that runway space. So I've been enjoying helping get that word out through my consulting with different bars and restaurants.
I love to hear it, and thank you for that. And Nicholas, on your end?
Frank, I think that's incredible. I'm going to add one more to your plate. We have 3 distilleries in Okinawa, and Okinawa's biggest brewery is Orion, and they do a rice-based beer, and it is hands down
my favorite Japanese beer, baby.
It's my favorite Japanese beer too. There's 2 places in New Jersey that sell it, so I don't want everybody now to Google it up and go out and buy my stash. But if we're to promote, and I always like to share the wealth and share the love. That is definitely something I would love to see. There's some fantastic Japanese beers that we can get access to, and I'd love to see that grow, as well as the sakes and sochus.
Really, the Japanese craft beer movement is where we were 15 years ago. So they're really just at that really beautiful nascent state of, like, they're about to pop.
That's awesome.
Actually, we have a great question here from Peter. Completely new to Japanese whiskey. If interested in taking the first step towards becoming acquainted with it, what's the best way to start? A good whiskey bar, your favorite liquor store, reviews, and favorite whiskey magazine? Great question. I'll let either of you take that.
I would recommend, especially here in New York, we have a couple of good Japanese whiskey oriented beverage programs, and go there. And if they're worth their salt, they're going to do small pours of whiskey. So they'll pour you an ounce or less. That way you can get an introduction of a flight of maybe 3 complete different styles, the single malt and a blend thrown in, and you get a small education and figure out whether it's for you or not without making the commitment of, a $200 bottle of 18-year-old whiskey.
I think it's great counsel. Depending where you are, Peter, I think that there's an opportunity for you to do that. If you're looking to go out and buy a bottle, there's some great liquor stores, just like you say, you can do plenty of searching online. You can find a Scotsman that perhaps has just launched a Japanese whiskey brand and is going to shamelessly plug something like
Shibui, perhaps?
Like a Shibui pure malt 10-year-old. Now, all joking aside, I think Frank makes the right call. Like, I think that if there's an opportunity for you to go and speak to a bar that's got a decent selection, and you can try and taste a few different options. I recommend that for any spirit or even wines and stuff like that as well. And if you want to go out and drop me a note, I'm happy to talk to you a little bit more about what we're doing at Shibui and chat the chat and let you know what it is that makes us different.
Amazing. I would actually like to add to that and kind of speak to what you guys have spoken to. Immersing yourself in the Japanese culture as a whole is something I always advise. So, whether it doesn't matter where it starts, some of the greatest sushi bars that even don't have a liquor license could notoriously have a bottle under the bar that has something that you've never tried before, and I think that's one of the coolest things ever. I remember, you go to Yamazaki and you look at the lady and she's got all these regular bottles on the counter, and you ask her what's under the counter, and there's this one a day is what they have, and you never know what it's going to be. It's going to be something special, though. I mean, that's what I love about that culture, is that if you know the ins and outs of it, there's a little more access granted to you, and I think you two know the ins and outs of it better than ever. So great answers from you guys. Peter, great question. Thank you so much. And Nicholas, thanks for offering to help Peter with that, and Frank as well. That's
my pleasure.
Very, very cool.
I'd love to help.
Well, guys, I'm actually devastated that the hour is up, but I probably intend to continue and hound you guys after hours for further discussion, because you guys have been fantastic. So Nicholas Pollacchi, SHIBUI Whiskey co-founder, thank you so much for being here. This was amazing. Frank Cisneros, one of the most iconic bartenders that Japan has ever really seen. Thank you so much for being here. This was extremely enlightening. If you guys want to continue learning about Bevridge, please check out bevridge.co and check out our upcoming whiskey kit, which is coming in the middle of March. And have a look at the YouTube with everything Bevridge. There are some amazing videos with fantastic guests, just like Nicholas and Frank. You can learn a whole bunch of stuff, not just about whiskey, but the world of spirits as a whole. Thank you guys so much once again for being with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Have a great night.
Take care, guys.